I was born in China. I was born in Gwangju, China, which is now the present name of the former Canton. I was brought to the United States at the age of 6 months by my parents. My father immigrated to the United States in 1937 at the age of 15. My mother happened to have been born in the United States. Their story is not atypical of the stories of Chinese American immigrants at that time. My mother was born in Cleveland. At that time, there were some 8 or 9 Chinese American families in Ohio. However, she remained in Cleveland with her family until the onset of the Depression. In 1933, at a very tender age, my mother was returned to China with her family because conditions here in the United States were just too difficult to endure. They had a family of 7 children, and my grandfather, my mother's father, had a modest restaurant, and it was not successful in the time of the Depression. So they went back to China, where they slowly returned to the United States. My mother, however, with her mother, my grandmother, and her sister, remained in China to keep her company, and remained in China through the war years. My father, who had come to the United States in 1937 as a teenager, came to serve in the United States Army Air Forces. And one of the proudest moments of his life, he was decorated, and he served very ably in the European theater, having flown missions, combat missions, in B-17 bombers. Following the conclusion of World War II, he returned to China to find a bride. My mother at the time was a young woman in their village, and of course the village matchmakers said, we have a natural fit here. We have a young man who has lived in the United States and is going to be returning. We have a young woman who has lived in the United States, and they seem to be a good match for each other. That's how I happened to be born there in 1947. They married, and I was born before they were able to return to the United States. So I came back to the, I came to the United States at the age of 6 months. And we first came to live in Queens, where I grew up and had my earliest experiences. In Queens, at that time, there were only a handful of Chinese American families. Of course, at that time, Chinese Americans were limited in the occupations they could pursue. They were doing laundries, cleaning businesses, and restaurants. And my father, unable to find a job in his chosen field of airplane mechanics after having been a United States service person and having learned the skills necessary, found he couldn't find mainstream employment in that field. So he opened, as his father before him had done, a laundry and cleaning store in Queens. And at that time, I grew up in a neighborhood where there were no Asian Americans. There were no Chinese Americans at all in my immediate neighborhood. I have a sister who is 2 years younger than I, and we were the only non-whites in the school for the entire 6 years of our elementary education. It's interesting, though, because the community that my parents chose to have their business in happened to be in the shadow of the Jamaica Supreme Court building on Sutton Boulevard. And that building is very much like the Appellate Division here. It was built in the same era. I'm not certain that the same architects were involved, but many of the features of that courthouse can be seen in this courthouse. So having grown up there in the shadow of the courthouse and having been literally surrounded by lawyers, I was probably influenced at that time to perhaps look into a career in the law. In fact, the Queens Bar Association was 2 doors down from our store. The occupants of the apartment over our store were lawyers, a modest law office, and there was a law office across the street. So with that kind of environment, I probably had my first exposures to the law. It wasn't the kind of experience, though, that was necessarily encouraging. because when speaking to the lawyers and the judges who were customers in my father's business, they told me very gently that there probably would not be a career for me in the law. They told me that there were no Asian lawyers, simply no Chinese American lawyers at the time. And indeed, they were correct. The small number of Chinese American lawyers who were practicing in the 1950s and 60s all seemed to come out of a common mold, and that is that they were World War II veterans, they went to law school on the GI Bill, and opened small practices in Manhattan, Chinatown, consisting of immigration, real estate, small business transactions. And those were the only lawyers of Asian background at that time. I was undaunted by that, of course, because that was the era of civil rights. And people were breaking down barriers in many, many areas, and I thought that perhaps that might be a barrier that I could break down. I have to say that I was also encouraged in my pursuits by some of the people who came into my father's business. One person who I'm particularly fond to remember is the Honorable Charles W. Frosell, who was a judge of the Court of Appeals from Queens, and he served from 1949 to 1961, as I recall. And Judge Frosell, of course, gave me advice along the lines of some of the other persons who were telling me about possible careers and futures in the law. And but he was different. He said that things are evolving, the minorities are emerging, you have a place. And with his encouragement, I received my first introduction to persons who could help me in my legal career. I was the first Asian American Assistant District Attorney in New York State history through an introduction by Judge Frosell to the then District Attorney of Queens County, who was Thomas J. Mackle, yes, who appointed me as the first Asian Assistant DA in 1973 in Queens. And I took it from there. I found a hospitable environment in the Queens DA's office. He was trying to build a diverse office. He had women assistants, he had assistants of color, and I found that I was very compatible with the environment there in the court at that time. I then went on to become Inspector General of the New York City Correction Department, and that was through the good offices of a former Queens District Attorney, Assistant District Attorney, Larry Finnegan, the Honorable Larry Finnegan, who had asked me to serve as his deputy in that agency at that time. He went on to a judgeship. I then went on to his office. In 1983, I was having a conversation with the general counsel of the Correction Department, who said that the then mayor, Ed Koch, is very interested in having a diverse judiciary. And he is looking for candidates from underrepresented communities. Have you thought about applying? And that probably stimulated my first interest in the court. I had a strong background in criminal justice in the DA's office. I had had 3 years experience in the Correction Department, again in criminal justice, and got through the committees and found myself as the first Asian American judge in New York State in 1983 when appointed by Mayor Koch. And that started my judicial career. One of my earliest mentors was Judge Frosell from the Court of Appeals. And not only was he involved heavily in the law and in the court, but was also involved in many other activities in the community and in his church. He was active in the Boy Scouts. He was a very active Mason. He was involved in business activities. He was involved as I recall, a director of the 1964-65 World's Fair. He is the person who encouraged me to be active in a variety of things, not just vocational and professional activities, but community, religious, and other activities that are important to the advancement of society. And he is probably the person that inspired me long ago to undertake other activities, to not just be a lawyer, but to be an active participant in the community and to enhance the lives of others. I am a graduate of the New York City Public Schools. I went to Brooklyn Technical High School, just blocks from here. As a matter of fact, my education has really come full circle, because after having gone as an undergraduate to the State University at Buffalo, I went on to St. John's University School of Law, which was located here in Brooklyn Heights at that time, having been in the last class to graduate from Brooklyn in 1972. So in the course of a 45-year legal career, I've gone full circle from law school here on Skirmhorn Street to chambers here on Monroe Place in the Appellate Division. So the circle of life has come full circle for me. I was very inspired by his service, his wartime service. And because of that, I had a long career myself in the New York Army National Guard. I became a member of the National Guard in 1970 while a law student. And I was able to obtain a commission as a lieutenant in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. And I stayed over 30 years in the New York Army National Guard, having retired in 2004. And I was a colonel in the Army Guard, and I was the state judge advocate, the chief legal officer of the Army Guard. And among other things, I did serve in the aftermath of 9/11, having supported civilian authority and aided in the recovery effort. I give great credit to my family, my parents, for nurturing me and my sisters. And I have two sisters, and one of them is 2 years younger than I am. The other one is 9 years younger than I am. And at the time we were growing up, the only occupations that were available to Chinese American men were in technical fields, engineers, architects, professions like that. And my parents were very devoted, and my sisters, of course, were good students, but they were encouraged just to become teachers. They were instructed to pursue that and to seek an education in free universities, and to find an engineer or a doctor or an architect to marry. To the credit of my sisters, they were very independent souls, and they decided that they could do something else. And they both went on to Ivy League universities. My older sister became a lawyer. The younger one became a medical doctor. And of course, in keeping with their traditions and wishing to please their parents, they married an engineer and a physician. So they have fulfilled all the responsibilities and their obligations, and were true to themselves. So I'm very fortunate that I came from a family in which all of us managed to find and achieve their dreams. My reception in the courts, particularly the Queen's courts, was rather warm and nurturing. But of course, there were always instances of bias and just old-fashioned racism. I can remember having gone into the grand jury with a stack full of papers to present a matter to the grand jury. The foreperson rises. He looks at me. He looks to the grand jurors and said, "What's he doing here? Who ordered takeout?" So it's the kinds of things like that that you have to deal with. And that is that I learned that you have to respond in a measured fashion, in an appropriate fashion, but you can't let it go. Being a member of a visible minority, you have to understand that you're always going to be viewed primarily as being a member of that group before any other associations are made. So I've learned to recognize and acknowledge that, and I've also learned in the course of my career to take advantage of that to some degree, and that is that Asians have a reputation for sincerity and for respectfulness and other traits, some of which are flattering, some of which are not necessarily flattering. But I learned in the course of my career to use those perceptions to advantage, and that is that I found that as a judge, I did much better in being more explanatory in the actions I was taking, in the rulings that I would be making, instead of being perhaps more efficient in just making a decision, making a pronouncement. I found that my own credibility, my own image was enhanced by the follow-through that I just mentioned. Asians are not viewed as persons who have the skill sets to be effective litigators and therefore not effective in the courtroom. I found that it's necessary to be yourself, and that is that, as you can tell from my background, I was not the product of a totally Asian community. Many of my contemporaries grew up in various Chinatowns, other ethnic enclaves. I did not. So in that regard, I was different from many of my contemporaries. But to my mind, stereotypes, of course, are what you have to deal with as part of an entire package, and that is that yes, there are going to be those expectations, but you have to go another step further, perhaps, in demonstrating that that expectation is not valid. I actually am not very good in math, and I can't play ping pong very well. But there is that expectation, and nor am I particularly proficient in the martial arts. So that is something that has to be accepted. I found that regarding stereotypes, the most damaging stereotype, perhaps to Asian-American lawyers and judges, is the stereotype that although effective and smart and hardworking, that they cannot be leaders. They cannot be leaders. They are not effective managers. There's something missing, perhaps, in that. That's why you'll find that there are those Asian Americans with excellent backgrounds and skills who are a little fearful of taking on management and leadership positions. I've tried to overcome that stereotype. I haven't gone out of my way to look for leadership positions, but I found myself able to obtain them. And I found that it was to my liking. I've been a administrative judge. I'm now a presiding justice. I was the state judge advocate, Army National Guard, leading 27 Army lawyers. I found that it was to my liking, and it was within my my skill sets and my ability. So that is something that I'm encouraging others who will follow my footsteps to recognize and to deal with.